Today we're going to be talking about universities. Are they Marxist? And the spoiler is, no, they're not. Representative Elise Stefanik recently issued a fairly typical conservative criticism of the university. She told Fox News, "We need to focus on engineering, math, science, the classics, and instead they're training not the next generation of leaders, but the next generation of Marxists." And that kind of rhetoric about university campus Marxism is common on the right. Many professors are Marxist or other varieties of radicals who hate America. Phyllis Schlafly warned in 2005. Sebastian Gorka laments in his book that we've ceded education to the radical left. J.D. Vance says the professors are the enemy. He's quoting Richard Nixon there. And if you read the Sacramento Observer, you can read an editorial arguing that pro-Palestine protests are a part of a long-standing trend toward Marxist indoctrination within our universities. Now, I've spent a lot of time in universities, and I've always found it a little difficult not to laugh when I hear professors described as Marxist. It seems pretty out of touch with the reality of academia, which is a fairly apolitical place for the most part. The percentage of professors who subscribe to the doctrines of Karl Marx is, as far as we can tell, vanishingly small. Now, we don't have great numbers on it. In 2006, there was a survey of American professors that found that only 3% of them are self-described Marxists. When I was in college in 2007 through 2011, which was at Brandeis, a very liberal university, which was known for having graduated Abby Hoffman, Angela Davis. I studied political theory for 4 years. I never had a single professor who showed any hint of being a Marxist. They were a bunch of liberals without any revolutionary instincts. And I actually don't know if I was assigned a page of Marx during 4 years in the politics department. I did take a course in the history department on the history of the conflict between Marxism and anarchism, but the professor wasn't actually a Marxist or an anarchist. He was just a cynic about all ideologies. Now, we might ask, what does it mean for a professor to be a Marxist? We hear about the Marxist universities. Do they actually have to accept a certain number of Marx's teachings? Which parts of Marx's teachings do they have to accept in order to qualify as a Marxist? After all, Marxism has a number of core propositions, and we have to boil it down to the essence of Marxism. We might say that these propositions are, number one, historical materialism. That's the theory that material economic conditions and modes of production are the primary drivers of historical and social development. Then there's dialectics, which is their method of understanding change and development through the interaction of opposing forces, where contradictions within a system lead to conflict, transformation, and then the emergence of a new order. Then there's, of course, class struggle, the ongoing conflict between social classes, especially between the working class and the owning class over control of resources and power. Then there's exploitation and alienation. Now, exploitation refers to the extraction of surplus value from workers by capitalists, and alienation describes the workers' loss of control over their labor, its products, and their own human potential. And then there's the instability of capitalism as a system, the view that capitalism is prone to recurring crises due to its internal contradictions, such as overproduction, falling profits, and inequality. Now, when you look at that list of the core tenets of Marxism, one of the things that should be obvious is that you can be a Marxist in a descriptive sense without being a Marxist in a normative sense. And I think that's probably a case for a lot of professors who do identify as Marxist. That is to say, Marx himself felt that he was doing social science and prediction, not merely practicing an ideology. And those tenets, things like capitalism is unstable, or the history of humanity is the history of class struggle, or material economic conditions and modes of production drive historical and social development. You can hold those regardless of whether you actually agree with Marx's substantive politics. You might believe that capitalism is unstable regardless of whether or not you like capitalism. You might think that historical materialism is sound, regardless of whether you think communism, such as the kind that Karl Marx advocated, is a desirable end state. So you can hold the tenets of Marxism as an analyst, regardless of your view on whether any of it is actually good. In fact, you could even believe in the existence of a class struggle without opposing the class struggle, or without believing in the overthrow of capitalism. Even Warren Buffett has said there's class warfare, but it's my class, the rich class, that's making war, and we're winning. In fact, sometimes if you read the Wall Street Journal, there's a certain Marxist flavor to it, because it talks about the existence of an ongoing power struggle between bosses and workers, using the kind of language that Karl Marx might have recognized. So even out of the very small number of professors who are self-described Marxists, some of them are likely adopting Marx's analysis without actually adopting his communist politics. Marx was a towering economist and sociologist, so much so that even the conservative economist Joseph Schumpeter paid a glowing tribute to Marx's abilities as an analyst, while he staunchly disagreed with Marx's political conclusions. Now, I mentioned that when I was in college, Marx was hardly assigned, at least in the politics program. But of course, that was before the 2008 financial crisis, which kind of revived an interest in Marx and his theories about the instability of capitalism. We then saw the publication of books with titles like Why Marx Was Right. So maybe Marxism is more prevalent now, after that world-shaking economic event put some of his theories back on the map and led more of the American public to adopt a critical view of capitalism and a more favorable view of socialism. Well, I can't find a recent survey like the 2006 one, examining whether professors are more self-described Marxists now than they were 15, 20 years ago. What we can do is we can kind of look through the curriculum at different colleges. We can look through the course catalogs and we can see, is Marx being taught? Is a Marxist framework being used in classes? And in fact, when you do that, it's quite interesting. Again, you see most clearly that so much of the course offerings are apolitical. There are things like computer science, or there are things like French literature. But we can see that Marx is present in some of the recent courses at Harvard and Yale. These were the ones that I looked at because these are the hotbeds of radicalism that conservatives detest. And we can see that out of the thousands of courses that are offered, hundreds and hundreds of pages. The Harvard course catalog has 2,600 pages of course offerings. And you can find a few classes that mention Marx. So you can find, for example, there's a class called Philosophy of Technology, from Marx and Heidegger to Artificial Intelligence. And you can see here how Marx is being used. Is technology good, bad, or neutral? If it's good, should we make it central to solving all of our problems? If it's bad, should we radically change our ways? If it's neutral, then what else should be the focus as we look for solutions to global problems? So thinkers who have something to say about technology from throughout the history of ideas, people like Marx and the right-leaning, Nazi-affiliated Heidegger, are being used to neutrally. A professor is not taking a stand here on what the answer to these questions, is technology good, bad, or neutral. They're trying to provoke thought, and they're using the writings of people like Marx and Heidegger to stimulate thought. Now, it strikes me here that here's Marx in the curriculum, but it's studying Marx as an important figure in the history of ideas, someone who can stimulate insights on technology in a way that has nothing to do with whether you accept the prescriptions laid out in the Communist Manifesto. Well, so here's a class where Marx is taught, but is it radical indoctrination? It seems like Marx is just included here as one of many thinkers who've had ideas about technology. And excluding him from a philosophy of technology course wouldn't make much sense. You'd be kind of suppressing one of the most influential thinkers on the subject. So if you're going to teach anything about the history of ideas, you're going to bump into Karl Marx a lot. So we can expect Marx to be taught in universities. But so many of the courses that we see that actually cite Marx are striking in how they do not attempt indoctrination. They present Marx as one of many influential thinkers whose work should be grappled with. So there's a class, for example, on political theory and the economy, which says that it's going to take a whirlwind tour across the history of political and economic thought, from Aristotle to Adam Smith to Karl Marx to Keynes to Hayek, to see how changing notions of economics have constrained or expanded the horizon of politics. There's another class, which is called Revolution. Now, this is at Harvard. This is a course on revolution and radicalism. And you'd think this would really be, if you could find anywhere where Marxist indoctrination was occurring, it would be in the Revolution class at Harvard. The American and French revolutions posed fundamental challenges to the nature of political authority at the end of the 18th century. What makes government legitimate? Should government be remade according to a design? What should we do when a government appears to be illegitimate? What are the promises and perils of thinking about government and society as constructs that should be remade to accord with human reason? Students can expect to read texts by some of the most influential political theorists of the era like Thomas Paine, Edmund Burke, Adam Smith again, the great theorist and exponent of capitalism, beloved by free market libertarians, Edmund Burke, the greatest of conservative philosophers, and then there's Karl Marx. Intro to Social Studies is teaching Hobbes and Rousseau, but they're also teaching Adam Smith, they're also teaching Darwin, they're also teaching Karl Marx. But in all of these listings, Marx is appearing actually alongside Adam Smith, patron saint of laissez-faire. Now, that's a distortion of his ideas. He wasn't really an exponent of laissez-faire, but we'll set that aside for now. The professors in these courses seem to be quite honestly trying to get their students to grapple with big questions, to turn on their brains, to critically examine the nature of society, economics, and government. Now, there are some courses in the course catalog on critical theory and feminism and black history. Harvard actually has one course that I would never take because it looks kind of awful. I don't like French theory and pompous jargon. It says it's going to examine the critical theorists who identify and rectify the pathologies of bourgeois modernity by examining systemic problems of capitalist society such as reification, commodification, repression, and instrumental reason, promising engagement with Lukács, Horkheimer, Benjamin, Adorno, Marcuse, Habermas, Jaegi, and Forst. I really don't fancy that myself. It seems like Chris Rufo's nightmare as well. Not that I care for him, but this kind of the French theory I've never much cared for. Continental philosophy, no thank you. But not everything in the university is for me. And like I say, there's 2,600 pages in the Harvard course catalog, so you can take a class with Steven Pinker instead. Although personally, I wouldn't do that either. So, but even if we zero in on the classes in critical theory or gender studies and say, aha, here's the leftism in the university, we've got a pretty distorted view of what the university tends to be like on average. The fact is that by far the most common undergraduate major in this country is business. Degrees in business, engineering, computer sciences, biomedical sciences are becoming more popular, while liberal arts degrees are becoming less so. The story of the university in our time is the story of the gutting of programs in history, sociology, philosophy, and the other so-called useless subjects. The neoliberalization of the university has waged war on the liberal arts, and it means students are less likely to take those big questions courses that might require you to read a few pages from Marx and Smith and think about how capitalism works and whether it's an entirely fantastic system. Now, I doubt that many of the business majors take classes where they'll be forced to ask those deep questions about the system they aspire to succeed in. Now, it's true that there aren't too many conservatives, as in Republican conservatives or MAGA types, among professors, which many on the right take as a sign they're being deliberately excluded from the academy. One of the requirements the Trump administration has tried to impose on Harvard is a mandate for viewpoint diversity, essentially affirmative action for conservative Republicans, making sure there are enough of them. But the absence of conservatives doesn't itself mean the presence of Marxists. Of course, many Republicans think anyone to the left of Mitt Romney is a communist or socialist or Marxist. Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, all of them have had these words flung at them as epithets, even though actual leftists, like we at Current Affairs, spend much of our time harshly criticizing these figures precisely because they don't accept the basic principles of socialism that we do. You can make a case that the academy leans Marxist, but only if you redefine Marxist to being center-left liberal, which isn't what Marx meant, and isn't what self-described Marxists from across the history of Marxism have meant by it. Well, I think there is a reason why there are more center-left liberals than conservatives in the academy, and I'm afraid the answer is going to make me sound like one of those snooty big city elites. But facts are facts. The right doesn't really actually like learning, curiosity, empathy, and intellectual adventure that much. You think Donald Trump reads books for pleasure? Do you think Elon Musk wants to set aside his prejudices, engage deeply with the works of thinkers he might disagree with? In fact, even the so-called right-wing intellectuals tend to be frauds who push lazy propaganda. Who are, after all, the great conservative intellectuals in our time? Charles Murray? Douglas Murray? Ben Shapiro? Jordan Peterson? Those men are fools. We've debunked their work extensively in Current Affairs. And so if they're shunned by the Academy, it's not because their ideology is disfavored, but because their statements collapse when scrutinized. In fact, possibly the most respected right-wing political theory professor of recent decades, Harvey Mansfield, was brutally torn apart for his logical errors and prejudices when his work was given a serious look by a genuinely deep and well-read thinker, Martha Nussbaum. And as Matt McManus has noted, there is actually a long tradition of right-wingers explicitly prioritizing instinct over reason, being hostile not just to our existing intellectuals, but to the intellectual enterprise writ large. They go on about the Western canon and the great books, but it often turns out they don't know anything about those books. And when they find out, they rush to ban Shakespeare plays from high schools for being too sexual. Now, some critics of the supposedly Marxist Academy essentially admit they're not talking about anything Karl Marx would recognize as Marxism. Mike Gonzalez, who is the author of a book called Next Gen Marxism, says he's not talking about a belief in historical materialism and alienation and so forth, but a set of ideas that have gone through what he calls a cultural distillation. The original economic orthodoxy has gone first through a cultural distillation in Europe, and then yet another here in America, with other features such as race, sex, and climate being added. Now, that editorial in the Sacramento Observer says the same, that other elements such as race, sex, and climate have been added to Marxism, but the oppressor versus oppressed paradigm is its essence. Now that's very interesting because it suggests that all talk, any talk, of oppression is inherently Marxist. So if you talk about, for instance, the oppression of Black Americans in the Jim Crow South, you've adopted an essential paradigm in which the world is divided into oppressed and oppressor groups, and therefore you are doing Marxism according to this definition of Marxism. And so here we finally have an understanding of what they mean when they say the university is some kind of Marxist indoctrination factory. They don't actually mean that the university is breeding Marxists, that it's going through the tenets of Karl Marx's ideas. What they believe is that too many people come out of college believing that oppression is real and that it's wrong. So that's how they could call the Palestine protest the product of Marxist indoctrination, even though there's nothing in the tenets of Marxism that's being espoused by the Palestine protesters. The truth is, people join the pro-Palestine protests because they see something happening that horrifies them. The killing of tens of thousands of people by a heavily armed military backed by the world's most powerful country. Now, it's true that that bears a resemblance to Marxism in the sense that Marx, too, looked out at his time and saw something that horrified him. He saw people toiling themselves to death in the dark satanic mills of the British industrial system. People who did almost nothing in their lives but work and whose bodies and minds were being destroyed to produce profits for rich capitalists. He saw oppression, just as people do look at Palestine today and see oppression. But you don't need indoctrination in order to perceive that reality. All it takes is an open mind and a bit of learning, which could be a very dangerous thing to those who would prefer we swallow whatever dogmas we grew up with. And I think there we see what conservatives really mean when they say the university is Marxist. Thanks for listening. Head to currentaffairs.org/subscribe to our beautiful Current Affairs print magazine today.